My name is Hak Hepburn, and I'm a PhD student at the Department of Anthropology. And I do environmental anthropology and specifically also sociocultural anthropology. So I look at long-term engagements with people's daily interactions with the environment in different ways. And my PhD project is called Thinking with Trees to See the Forest. The subtitle for this talk is different. But what that is really is an anthropological approach. So it's a play on that well-known idiom, you can't see the forest for the trees. And that idiom is referring to the difficulty that people have in seeing the big picture when they get bogged down in the details. But anthropology, and especially sociocultural anthropology, is really about focusing in on those individual stories and those everyday lived details to draw into and understand larger processes. So it's really about what gets lost in those macro level studies and statistics to really focus in on those daily lived realities of people. And so that's what Thinking with Trees to See the Forest is really about. My PhD project is actually focusing on one particular tree species, but today I'm going to share a couple different stories about how people in San Martin engage with trees and forests. And really what it is, my title is also a sort of theoretical play, especially in sociocultural anthropology. There's more of a turn to engage with what's called multi-species ethnography or attention to the non-human, and that's really about how humans our human lives are so entangled with the non-human species that we share our lives with and how our lives are affected with that. Thinking with trees is really about thinking with and alongside trees to recognize trees as being able and having the capacity to respond to their environment, which sometimes we forget or we don't learn as much about in, like a grade school science, for example. And today, scientists are only really just now starting to prove the extent of this capacity. So they've been studying it throughout the 20th century, but there's been an explosion of science in biology, in forestry, showing and really what you're showing in this exhibit is showing the ability of trees to respond to their environment. But why I'm talking about this is people have known about this forever. People have always told stories about the ability of trees to communicate and to respond to their environment, and that's what I do as an anthropologist. So I'm interested in all the different ways that people actually talk about the ways trees can engage with themselves and with their environments around them. So my work is in San Martin, Peru. So it seems far away from here, and it is, but it's in this northern part of Peru. And I've been going there since 2012. So about 7 years ago, I started living there. I went officially as an international volunteer, fell in love with the place, stayed longer. I lived there for about, straight on for about 2 years before coming here. And since then, I've been going back and forth. So since I've moved back, I've spent a lot more time, and I go every year, and I'm about to go. My PhD project is actually just about to begin. So I'll be going in a couple weeks for the next year and a half to explore the ways that people talk about trees and forests. But I'm going to be drawing on my long engagement with this place to tell the stories today. And what I wanted to explain a little bit, I'm going to read this long quote because it gets at a little bit of the stories and the importance of trees and forests in Peru. And this is from a Peruvian Ministry of Environment book called Peru's Kingdom of Forests. And they actually have both a Spanish and English translation besides. So I'm going to read the English translation. So bear with me, it's not the best English, but it is understandable, just as a warning. But contrary to common belief, the richness of the forest not only lies in its trees, but in the chemical, physical, and social relationships established by the species that reside there. In ecological terms, a collection of trees, however extensive it may be, is not enough to be a forest. A metaphor illustrates this. For it to be achieved, even while being small, it needs to be a story-like forest, meaning with diverse characters like heroes and a history of interactions and dependencies, of singularities. All of this is possible through millions of years of biological narrative, of evolution. That is why a forest cannot be invented, how we intend, nor move out of place. It is also not possible to invent its animals, placing them there to prevent their extinction. A spectacled bear learns to differentiate stems, flowers, and barks because his mother shows him, tells him. It is something that no one else can teach in the same manner. Manatee calves breastfed from milk bottles can be released into the rivers where they have already disappeared, but they would still require a couple, similarly, to teach them their culture. The forests indeed have a culture and a language that only they speak. They are polyglots. Now the forests tell their own story. The rivers, the fish, the rocks, the insects, the hummingbirds, the flowers with which they feed, they all tell. Our forests have flourished thanks to that unintelligible language, that alphabet of cells, of millions of cells. It is not just another metaphor. Thanks to its loquacity, our forests have prospered through a knotted geography of glaciers, volcanoes, plains, canyons, deserts, lakes on frigid summits, rivers, cascades, rock walls. Every climate zone with its unique atmospheric conditions molded a distinct type of forest. And the reason I wanted to share that is because it's talking about the importance of the entire ecosystem and the connections that trees have. And my project, by focusing on different trees and the stories, is that people in San Martin also recognize these connections and these stories. So I just want to share some photos. So what they say, for example, is in a water hole in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, they will recognize and call the mothers of the animals that take care of that water. So for example, if you see spiders and snakes right by that water, they are the mothers of that water, and the importance of the connections between those species maintain that water, which then allow the people to come in and use it. So for example, in traditional indigenous of their beliefs, they should only use a natural cup that they carve out of a nut that is from a palm, because you don't want to disturb the mothers of that water to make sure that it has continued existence. And they foster those relationships, and that's the relationships that are really important. And those comes out in the types of stories that they tell about their environment. So they all grow together. I will share a couple of those stories, but I also want to tell about how important these connections are. And so the Ministry of the Environment in Peru was also calling on the fact that we cannot necessarily just recreate these on our own, because these ecological connections are so important. We need to actively foster the connections and take care of them. And that's especially hard. So in my work, I'm in San Martin, and it has the highest rate of deforestation in Peru. And that's why it's so important to try and foster these stories about trees. So these are maps from the National Forest, I forget the translation, but bosques, which is forests. And they are the national, they monitor forests in Peru. And these are maps that they've released in 2016 showing deforestation across Peru. So 60% of Peru's territory is actually in the Amazon basin. So all of this green is considered the Amazon basin. And my work up here in San Martin, which is this cutout right here, is part of the Andean Amazon. So right along here is the Andes, or the Andes Mountains. In the Andes Mountains, there are several cordilleras that go into the lowland Amazon that you think of if you picture the Amazon and the floodplains. So part of San Martin is lowland, but a lot of it is very hilly. And it's actually just below the cloud forest. So some parts, if you go up top, especially where the red parts are there, right at the top, that's cloud forest. But mostly down here, it's just considered upper mountain forest. And part of the reason that it's had such high rates of deforestation is because, for example, up here, Moyobamba, which is the capital of the region, it was actually founded by Spanish colonists in 1540. So that was almost 500 years ago. So if you think in the terms and the timescales of European colonization, this is one of, I mean, you can't compare if you're thinking about BC. And it was actually used as a jumping off point for early European explorers to reach into further into the Amazon basin. What you also see is there was a road built in the 1970s, and actually a lot of the deforestation has happened since the 1970s. Because once these towns were founded, so 1540 in Moyobamba, around here, around 1650s, and those are the biggest towns. But what actually happened was it was sort of forgotten about by most of the Peruvian state. And they were trying to bring it into the working economy. They did use it to extract a lot of resources. But in the 1970s, they wanted to build a road. Also, in part of their efforts to colonize the Amazon and bring it into just to secure the government's jurisdiction. And so what you see along here, as you would see elsewhere in the Amazon and elsewhere in the world, is a lot of the deforestation happens around the road. So again, why does this matter? Especially in the context of climate change, 10% of anthropogenic greenhouse gases, according to, these are 2014 percentages, but they are emitted through land degradation and deforestation. In Peru, it's even higher. So 33% of Peru's anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions comes from deforestation and land degradation. And in a place where that has the highest levels of deforestation or has experienced the greatest forest loss in the country, it's really important to think about deforestation's effect in San Martin. Worldwide, 33% of greenhouse gases, however, can be mitigated and absorbed from trees and forests. And most of these are from young trees actually absorb more carbon from the atmosphere. But you lose a lot when you cut down, for example, old growth forests. And this is, so Peru's outlook and their mitigation strategy, they actually also expect that 2/3 of their reductions of emissions can come from changes in soil uses and in changes in how they engage with the forests. So that's their official numbers. And I just wanted to, because we are in Canada, this is also really important because the ecological connections, even when they're not man-made emissions, the degradation of forests that we have can also reduce their own resilience. So for example, in BC, we've had a lot of wildfires, and while managed forests in Canada actually are a sink of carbon emissions, if you include, this is from Canada's Ministry of Natural Resources, their own figures, if you include the effect of wildfires and blight, Canada's forest emissions emits carbon into the atmosphere and contributes to, for example, climate change. So back in San Martin, people really rely on forest resources for their survival. So what does this mean? It's a largely rural area. The largest city has about 150,000 people, and it is one of the fastest growing cities, but it's still small enough. There's no high rises. People still have connections with the forest around them. And there's a lot of small villages. So this is one small village. It's a legally titled native community, which is the legal name for indigenous. So they have indigenous title. And they belong to, in Peru, you refer them as ethno-linguistic groups. So they belong to or identify as Quechua Lemista. And they've carved out their village from the surrounding countryside. And these are people who are coming back where they go every day. They walk through the jungle trails to go to their chakras, which are their agricultural fields and agroforestry fields. However, they also survive. They survive off of growing coffee. And this is them coming back, and they're carrying stuff from their chakra. And the way that they often have to do this is they have to clear out space from the forest. So one of the largest causes of deforestation in Peru is that it's attributed to small-scale clearings for agriculture. And so often people can be blamed for causing the deforestation that then aggravates a lot of negative effects of climate change, like lower levels of rainfall, soil erosion, and hotter temperatures, which people complain about. And so this is a woman on her way to a chakra. It's a freshly cleared chakra, so she's sort of walking along the treetops. It has some interesting, I'm just going to mention this. One way that people will clear land is then they will burn it. So slash and burn agriculture. They will burn it so that the nutrients then are returned to the soil, and then they will leave it to fallow after a few years, which uses a wide expanse of land. But these people actually belong to a co-op, so they actually can't burn it. They've agreed not to burn it. But you still have to clear it to have space to grow things. So that's why all the trees are left there. They will use the trees as cooking fires. But so I just wanted to have this as an example of the really intricate ways that people rely on the forest and walk through the forest every day. But some trees, even when clearing spaces for chakras, should not be cut down. So this is what is called an ojé. It's a type of ficus. And it should never be cut down. Of course, sometimes it is. But most trees, especially important trees, and not only in indigenous stories, but also in mestizo, and which are the mixed descendants of indigenous and of the Spanish explorers, share these stories. And about ojé, it's a particular type of powerful tree. And what they say is that the trees often have little spirits or devils that live inside of them, although really it's part of the tree. And what they say about ojé, it's a particularly trickster tree. And so there's many, many stories of a man, he had a couple too many drinks, and he's stumbling home through the chakra at night, and he walks by the ojé, and he sees a person, an appearance, who calls him over, like, oh, just come rest. And the little man, he's had a couple too many drinks. He's a little tired. He's like, oh, that's a good idea. And he might lie down to the tree, and he'll have dreams of the spirit of the tree, who then takes care of him, gives him a bed, maybe a hot meal. And sometimes these people never return. But sometimes if the tree is good, or if the man was good or showed himself to be good, the tree will show mercy and allow him to go back on the next day. And then they share these stories and realize that it was the spirit of the tree that they saw. And there are all sorts of these stories. They also come back to these connections. So another type of ficus, which I don't have a photo, but another type of ficus called renaco is also really important, and you shouldn't go near it. But part of the reason that you shouldn't go near it is often these giant bullet ants that are about that big. They are that big. Tend to live around this tree, around renacos. And they won't kill you, but they are considered to be the most painful bite that you can experience from an insect.
They guard the tree?
Yeah, they guard the tree. So one way that you can do this to not get injured by these trees is to appease them with tobacco. And tobacco is a very important sacred plant all across the Americas. And what you do when you're going into the jungle, whether to hunt or to harvest trees for their medicines, for example, is you have to appease the spirits of the jungle and of the trees with tobacco. And that is also rumored to help you defend against snakes, for example. There's a lot of poisonous snakes in the area. And an important part is people rely on a lot of these trees for medicines. So someone asked right before if I would talk about ayahuasca. So ayahuasca has gotten a lot of attention in the news, in popular news cycles, for being, a tea, a brew that intrepid adventurers will journey into the jungles of Peru to have this enlightened experience. And ayahuasca grows in this part of the world. It's quite prevalent. It's in a lot of different areas, and it has a long historical importance to Indigenous people in the area. And it is an important tree, or it's not a tree, it's a liana, but you also combine it with leaves, bark from another tree. But it speaks to the importance of the way that people can engage with the environment in this place. So part of the reason that ayahuasca is so revered, it's because it's considered one of the mothers of the jungle as a whole. And it's one of the ways that people can access and communicate with trees and plants. However, it's not the most important one. There are other more powerful ones as well, like Toe, which is a brugmansia, and that's a tree that also has these hallucinogenic properties. There's a lot of plants that have these alkaloids in them, the bitter plants that attribute to bitter medicine that people engage with. One thing that's really important and interesting is the Quechua Lemista, which is the main indigenous group in a northern part of San Martin where I lived and work, is that they are also known for their tree bark medicine. And it's considered what they consider even more powerful than the types of medicines that you will get from ayahuasca. And ayahuasca is relied on sort of this hallucinogenic experience, and it's been really commodified. It's caused a lot of problems. But the other way, what's considered more powerful, is actually a different way of engaging with trees and plants. And the way that those trees and plants will speak to you is partly from your dreams. And it's considered a more powerful and a more real and genuine experience of engaging with these. But in general, if you want to use any of the medicines of the forest, of which there are many, you would appease them with tobacco. There are also spirits in general that guard the jungle as a whole. So my partner and I were going on a walk, and we were trying to find a waterfall. And we saw a young boy sitting on an edge, and we stopped to ask him a question. We're like, "Oh, do you know if this is the right path to get to the waterfall?" And he was like, "I don't know, I'm not sure." But he happened to be sitting beside another path that went up the hill. So we decided to follow that path. And we sort of got lost. We're like, "Oh, this is not where we were supposed to be going." So we decided to turn back down and came back the other path and did actually find the waterfall. When we were coming back up, we saw the boy again. And we thought it was so strange what he was doing there. And he sort of huddled away. But just then we saw some steam rising from a natural hot spring that we wouldn't have seen if we hadn't seen that guy there. And when my partner and I looked at each other and talked about it afterwards, we thought that young boy must have been a Chujachakwi. Chujachakwi is a shapeshifter and the protector of the forest. And Chujachakwi refers to sort of a hobbled left foot. And that's how you can recognize them. And funnily enough, it looks like this young child did have a bit of a hobble. And what Chujachakwi does is they will shapeshift into someone that you may recognize, and they'll give you bad directions to get lost in the forest. And part of the reason that they do that is because they want to protect the forest as a whole. So again, if you are considered untrustworthy, then you will be led astray. And there are all sorts of stories like this about the jungle and about these landscapes. But people themselves also defend their land against mega projects. So they might also contribute to some deforestation because they need to clear land for their sustenance. But especially Indigenous people have had to deal with encroachments of land since colonization. So there's a longer story here where when Spanish colonizers established their cities, they pushed indigenous people further and further away because they were taking up the best land. Also, a lot of migration from elsewhere in Peru is going into this area to clear land because of land pressures elsewhere. And it's been promoted by the state. There's also a lot of interest in terms of large-scale extraction projects. There's a palm oil plantations that are being put in, and local people have actively fought to get recognition for their land tenure in order to defend against these types of projects. So these people live here, and they need to use this space any way that they can, because they've had all of these as well historical marginalizations that continue in today. Poverty levels are fairly high, although they're somewhat improving. But the stories that they share and tell on a regular basis about how to properly engage with the trees and the plants and the forests are important, because they also foster and share stories about the importance of the relationships that not only people have with trees and that trees have with us, but that trees share with each other. Thank you.